Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jihad Abu Salim. I'm the Executive Director of the Jerusalem Fund, and I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Professor Wadie Edward Said. Professor Wadie, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry, I misplaced my charger, so I apologize for that.
No worries. Thank you so much for joining. And we are also joined by Professor Darrell Lee, who teaches anthropology and law at the University of Chicago. Professor Lee will also be will lead the discussion part of this event tonight. I'm really grateful for everyone to join us tonight. I know this is a difficult time. This is a critical moment in Palestinian history and in the experience of the Palestinian people. And I am grateful that you're able to join us tonight and be part of this conversation. The Jerusalem Fund is a DC-based Palestinian nonprofit. Our work focuses on educating the US public on the Palestinian experience, tell Palestinian stories, and we provide humanitarian aid to our communities on the ground. And as we're witnessing the horrific genocide that's unfolding in Gaza, I am honored to be part of this space tonight to honor the memory of the late Professor Edward Said in this event titled A Life Between Scholarship and Resistance, Reflections on Edward Said's Enduring Legacy. And tonight we will be in conversation with Professor Wadie Said, Professor of Law at the University of Colorado Boulder. Professor Wadie will reflect on the multifaceted aspects of Edward Said's life and legacy, delving into Edward Said's unwavering commitment to justice and his lasting effects on subsequent generations of scholars and activists. And on a day like this, as we witness the genocide unfold in Gaza, I, as a Palestinian from Gaza whose family is there, I remember Edward Said and honor his memory for many reasons. Edward Said has shaped scholarship on the Middle East, understanding of the region, and he advocated and fought his entire life to center the Palestinian narrative and highlight the Palestinian experience. Despite decades of dehumanization and racism, this is the same dehumanization and racism that's being used to justify the bloody assault on our families in Gaza as we speak right now. So tonight, we are going to hear from Professor Wadie Said about Edward Said's legacy, and we will also open the space for some reflections on the unfolding situation in Palestine. If you have questions, and I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to address the questions to our speakers. After Professor Said gives his talk, we will be joined by Professor Darrell Lee at the University of Chicago, who generously offered to moderate the discussion and share some reflections as well. Allow me now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Wadie Edward Said is a professor of law at the University of Colorado Boulder. Professor Said most recently was a faculty member at the University of South Carolina School of Law. He has also served as a visiting professor in the Law and Society program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and as an assistant federal public defender in the Office of the Federal Public Defender for the Middle District of Florida, where he represented one of the defendants in U.S. versus Al Aryan, a complex terrorism conspiracy case. Professor Saeed's scholarship analyzes the challenges and human rights implications of criminal prosecution and immigration enforcement in several areas of law that touch on national security and foreign policy. His book, Crimes of Terror: The Legal and Political Implications of Federal Terrorism Prosecutions, the first comprehensive legal analysis of the criminal terrorist prosecution in the United States, was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. He teaches courses in criminal law, criminal procedure, immigration law, and seminars on international human rights law and counterterrorism. He's a graduate of Princeton University and the Columbia University School of Law, where he served as an articles editor of the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. Professor Wadie, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm sure you planned a different talk, or maybe a very relevant one for tonight's event. The floor is yours. I'm personally looking forward to hearing your reflections, and then we'll open it for the discussion and Q&A. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jihad, for that kind introduction. Especially in light of the current circumstances, I'd like to thank you and the center, the Palestine Center, for inviting me, also to Daryl for being here as well, and everyone who's attending. For me, to be able to honor my father by delivering a lecture in his name 20 years after his passing is of great importance. So as Dr. Jihad was just pointing out, when this lecture was first scheduled, I envisioned it as both a celebration of his work from a more personal, as well as an opportunity to explore the ways in which his legacy remains so intensely strong and relevant, despite the passage of so much time. Obviously, the events of the last 10 days, today, require me to shift my planned remarks, as what was more retrospective now takes into account the current moment in all its horror and devastation. Still, I would say that I envision this talk as one of some personal memories with analysis of my father's work, plus a look at how it affected and continues to affect my own work. I think here I'll be taking I'll be interspersing some of these personal remarks and reflections and analysis of the current moment with some what you might call, highlights is the wrong word, but some maybe selected examples from the law to kind of explain the moment we're in a little bit, and try to make sense of what's going on from a legal perspective, particularly as it relates to Palestinians in the United States, by, as I mentioned, offering some reflections from my own experiences and studies. To start, I'd like to go back to March of 1999, where my mother, father, and I took what was my father's last trip to the Gaza Strip, then a tightly controlled but not yet besieged enclave with one of the world's highest population densities, with internal security then the province of the Palestinian Authority, and the external borders controlled by the Israelis on all four sides, including acting as a barrier between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. At that time in 1999, the Israelis also held 40% of the land of Gaza for various settlements, the largest being the Qatif block at the southern end of the Strip. And if you were to go to Gaza, you would see the military would, at any moment, in a kind of haphazard basis, would shut down Gaza's main roads because the settlers in the various Israeli settlements, whenever they wanted to leave, they would leave with a full military escort or a closed road. So Gaza's main arteries would be shut down without notice, and people would be stuck until the settlers and the military had passed. In any event, at this point, we were staying in Jerusalem, and I had rented us a car during our visit. My father was set to be hosted by the late Dr. Haydar Abdeshafi in Gaza City for a series of public meetings. And I was told we were to arrive around 11:30 or so, meaning we had to leave Jerusalem about 10. I was out late the night before with my friends, ironically, most of whom were students from Gaza, Rafah to be precise. They were students at Birzeit University in the West Bank. It was a kind of an interesting moment where I became friends with people when I was in Palestine and stayed in touch with them as we were both Palestinians, but not from the West Bank where we were living. In any event, I had stayed up late the night before, smoking argili, catching up with my friends after being away for a while. At this point, I was a little slow to get up in the morning. My parents were getting irritated. Let's go. We have to be there at 11:30. What if we were late and they've already left? Et cetera, et cetera. We were going to be met at the Erez checkpoint by representatives of Dr. Haydar. And my dad was very nervous. I said, please don't worry, but they were insistent. My dad in particular was most upset because he was never late and he took his appointments very seriously. On the way there, I drove pretty fast to make up for lost time and even crossed the center line of the highway while trying to get around a slower car. One thing the Palestinians and Israelis have in common is their crazy driving. So an Israeli police officer on the side of the road about a quarter mile ahead, engaging in traffic enforcement, saw me and stepped into the highway with a massive assault rifle and pointed at me, signaling at me to pull over. I did, and he approached my car and started yelling at me in Hebrew. I produced my American passport and answered in English. He saw my parents in the car and he calmed down a little. Why are you going so fast? Well, we're late meeting friends by the beach, I said. He said, okay, I'll let you go, but next time I take you to Mahkama. He said it in Arabic to hammer home the point. The rest of the drive was a bit less frenzied, but we didn't get to the Erez checkpoint until around 1:30 and arrived at our destination in Gaza City about 2:15. My father was apologizing to everyone along the way about being late and how worried he was that we would have been stranded at Erez because his reception committee would have left, given that we were late. Yeah, Dr. Edward, came the reply from Dr. Haydar. This hardly counts as late, as we were so glad you made it today. We were prepared to wait at least until tomorrow, possibly the next day. Even then, many years before the start of the blockade in 2007, Gazans felt the impact of their isolation deeply, but it was important for my father to go into interact with the people there and let them know how important they were to him. He was especially moved to return there after Yasser Arafat temporarily banned his books a year or so earlier. And I told him the story of my visit to a bookstore in Rafah with my friend Mohammed, who is from there, while I was on a visit. We went to a bookstore and inquired about Edward Said's books. The store owner said, oh, his books are banned. But when he saw the look on our face, he said, if you come back this afternoon, I can probably get you a copy, which we did, and he did as well. The people of Gaza are resourceful and didn't appreciate censorship, even from their own leadership. Now, in reflecting on my father's legacy, it's a strange emotion or dynamic to describe because parents have to be teachers whether they intend to be or not. So I absorbed the lessons of my father as any son would, but I also began to learn about his work. Now, starting in my early teens, I tried to interact with my father, but obviously books like Orientalism, Beginnings, Intention, and Method, and The World, the Text, and the Critic were beyond my capabilities. They still might now be as well. But at the time, I was moved by his activism and writings that were more accessible. Here, I'm going to specifically point out his 1986 article, which I'm sure many of you know, The Essential Terrorist. It has relevance for us today. It was a review of a book edited by the then Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu, about the so-called plague of terrorism. It had the title, Terrorism, How the West Can Win. My father's quip in response to that was, win what? The timing of the article coincided with a bizarre incident from the 1980s in which my father was to appear on ABC's Nightline with Forrest Sawyer. Ted Koppel had the night off for some reason. Where on Nightline, my father was set to debate Netanyahu, but it didn't happen. In fact, we were ushered into a different building in the ABC News studios than where Netanyahu appeared, because he said he wouldn't appear on television with my father, was my father was there to kill him. Puzzled, we went to the building, and I was actually with my father, and I watched the appearance. And Forrest Sawyer began by saying that the two men were appearing apart because they both claimed that the other wants to kill them. So my father corrected him. No, I'll debate him, but he won't speak to me because he claims I want to kill him. This article and this incident was important because it had language I could understand. My father summarized it as basically identifying terrorism and the phenomenon of terrorism. Let's be clear here, most specifically focused on Palestinian terrorism. My father summarized Netanyahu's edited book and the various contributors as saying that, to use my father's words, the root cause of terrorism lies not in grievances, but in a disposition toward unbridled violence. And with that, the definition took hold, especially among American governmental circles, where it continues to have effect to this day. There have been other scholars who have done work more recently on showing exactly how this Netanyahu-led campaign regarding who and what were terrorists, what was terrorism, et cetera, has been the reference point for the United States government since the 1980s. And we see it now with the merciless and self-righteous Israeli ultra-violence on the Gaza Strip, home to a large refugee population in a tiny area denied access by walls and weapons to the land from which they came just beyond those walls. These are not people with a claim or a grievance. They're just predisposed to kill Israelis. And that's the mindset, and that's what we're seeing today. In any event, this article, but more generally my father's work that I could access, will offer the type of revelations that made me try to study the law, to make an attempt to understand if there was a way to mount arguments against the objectification of Arabs and Muslims in the United States and Israeli claims to moral superiority and acting legally. I went to law school. I took a class on the laws of war, which was awful and unsatisfying for many reasons. The only redeeming thing about it was that my wife was in the class with me. But as we say in Arabic, la hayat liman tunadi, or roughly translated, there was no there. The laws of war, or as it's also known, international humanitarian law, which I find to be an oxymoron up there with military intelligence and jumbo shrimp. This law does not have any specific conventions, for example, on the use of air power. So major military nations like the United States, Russia, Israel, France, England, China, etc., can bomb away while only being governed by abstract concepts like proportionality, all the while denying, and in their logic, plausibly denying that they target civilians, as today's example evidences. This, of course, lays the groundwork for the distinction between us, in the case of the West, Americans, Israelis, Europeans, etc., and the terrorists who always target civilians. Full stop. This is important. As mentioned, we watch Gazans being bombed mercilessly, devoid of context, etc. The context-free focus on the terrorist as terrorist because he commits terrorism is encapsulated not just in concepts of the laws of war or manipulated by the laws of war, but in American domestic law. Now, I've spoken and written about this ad nauseum, but I do want to look at some laws here, or in particular one law from the American context that I think will help explain a fair bit about the predicament in which we find ourselves. So let's look at the main law criminalizing terrorism in the United States. That's Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 2339B. That's the ban on providing material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations. Okay, so let's look at this. The list of banned foreign terrorist organizations was first issued in 1997. Now, there's a process by which the Secretary of State designates a group as a banned foreign terrorist organization. It's 1, foreign; 2, commits terrorism; 3, that terrorism impacts U.S. national security, the security of U.S. nationals, or United States national security interests, like their foreign relations interests. So, for example, it's not just that a group, for example, targets the United States. If it targets an ally of the United States, it can be listed as long as the Secretary of State says that it should. So that last determination of who gets on there is entirely within the discretion of the Secretary of State. It's not something that you or I or courts have any say in. Okay. So this lends itself to selectivity. Who gets on the list? Groups that the United States considers an enemy. Other groups that engage in terrorism may not be listed because they don't warrant such a designation in the eyes of the Secretary of State. So there's that element of selectivity. There's that element of selectivity to it. There's another element of selectivity in a second here. But what essentially that means is that any group that provides what's called material support to a foreign terrorist organization, or FTO, can be prosecuted. Anyone who provides material support can be prosecuted for providing that material support. Now, originally, the law was passed in 1996 by Congress to deal with the purported pressing problem of terrorist organizations raising money for their activities under the cover of humanitarian or charitable activity. This was directly the kind of quintessential terrorist group that this was targeting was the Hamas movement, the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, which was perceived by the United States to be active here in raising money for its charitable operations, which as Congress kind of declared and made a finding in passing the law, that money is fungible. Money for charity frees up money for weapons, etc. Now, that was in 1996. I have yet to see convincing evidence that Hamas was raising money in any significant way in this country under cover of charitable activity, but that's another story, maybe, or maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. In any event, now what we see is when a group is designated as an FTO, it's perceived as so tainted by its criminal conduct that any contribution to such an organization facilitates that conduct. So it's basically radioactive. And in the vagaries of American constitutional law, you can be a member of a foreign terrorist organization, okay, but you can't do anything really to provide it with material support. Now, the designation and the creation of the category of foreign terrorist organization actually has, as a legal matter, its genesis in a 1995 executive order issued by President Clinton relating to the opponents of the Middle East peace process. This was a list of organizations and individuals who were perceived to be opposed to the Middle East peace process, and as a result could be, by executive order, prescribed from anybody doing any business with them or interacting with them in a meaningful way. It was a mildly nonsense. I mean, all these lists and things have, they exhibit the misunderstandings or kind of sometimes nonsensical nonsensical inclusions on the list. So, for example, the 1995 executive order, which was the precursor to the actual congressional legislation that was passed, the material support ban and the creation of the FTO category. The 1995 executive order had on it, for example, one of the proscribed individuals was a fellow called Aboud Zumar, who was one of the people convicted by Egypt of the assassination of President Anwar Sadat in 1981. Well, in 1995, he'd been in Egyptian prison for 14 years. How someone was going to interact with him to disrupt the Middle East peace process was not entirely clear if you know anything about Egyptian prisons. Any of it. By the time the list of foreign terrorist organizations, which is, as a legal classification, much more kind of systematic and serious than a mere executive order, and allows for greater penalties. If someone is convicted of providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization, they can be sentenced to up to 20 years in prison. By the time the first list comes out in October 1997, there are 27 groups on the list, okay? 8 of those groups are Palestinian one of them is Lebanese Hezbollah, but 7 of them are Palestinian. So around a quarter of the groups, if not more, are there because of their opposition to the United States-led peace process. Okay. Hamas is the kind of quintessential FTO here. And it serves as the basis of the terrorist group that's also raising money under cover of charitable activity. This is a powerful construct that takes hold. It even predates, by the way, the inclusion on the list of the Al-Qaeda organization, which didn't get listed until 1999. Okay. Now, you might ask yourself, well, groups get on the list. Can they get off? Yes, if the Secretary of State decides to do so. Again, this is a finding that you and I have no basis to challenge or argue for. So there was a group that eventually, an Iranian dissident group called the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a kind of a strange cult-like organization that argued throughout many years after it was listed in 1997 that it shouldn't be on the list because it considered America its great friend, and they were both opposed to the Iranian regime. All those court cases and litigation didn't bear fruit, but in 2012, an outside campaign convinced then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to delist the group, which she did. Why? She had her reasons, but it's not because the group didn't engage in non-state violence. It was purely a matter for her discretion as the Secretary of State. Nothing you or I could say about it. This leads to sometimes absurd results. For example, there was an organization, a Palestinian organization known as the Fatah Revolutionary Council, or the Abu Nidal organization. That group was delisted in 2017. Abu Nidal himself died in 2002, and the group ceased to operate. Why it took 15 years to come off, I can't tell you. Other than being nonsensical, it's also sometimes chilling. The one Israeli group that was on the list was called Kach, or Kahana Chai, and it was there for many years, but it was delisted in 2022 with the Secretary of State essentially saying they were no longer very active. I would maybe question that, okay, as the group is still very present now in the Israeli government in the form of its national security minister, Ben-Gvir, who is a proud Kahanist. His protestations to the contrary, not so availing. Now, there's a double selectivity in this, as I mentioned. One is who gets on the list, the other is who gets prosecuted. So as Jihad mentioned in the introduction, I worked as a lawyer on the prosecution against the former University of South Florida computer science professor, Dr. Samuel Arian, along with several other Palestinians, one of whom I personally represented, a fellow by the name of Hatem Fariz. And I tried to argue that the government was selectively targeting Palestinians. Right? The government said that they were members of the so-called North American wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a banned foreign terrorist organization, which of course I didn't believe to be true. I think the result of the case proved that that was at the very, very least, an overstatement by the government. More likely it was just untrue. But I tried to argue that Palestinians were being selectively prosecuted, where others, like Kahanists, were not. Okay? The court denied that motion repeatedly and without much fuss. There was not really any evidence I could produce because these were decisions that were made within the discretion of the United States Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice. Again, these distinctions about who's a terrorist and who gets prosecuted are outside the purview of us as citizens, right? We can't affect these decisions directly. Now, material support has become something as I mentioned, something I've written about a great deal, and I feel it's quite dangerous. It serves as the main law that the United States government has used to prosecute individuals it suspects of being engaged with terrorism. But it's not limited to money or weapons or things like that. In 2010, the Supreme Court the Supreme Court ruled, the United States Supreme Court ruled that material support in the form of speech could be criminalized. So individuals who want to help groups, say, for example, be more peaceful by advocating the use of international law or petitioning the United Nations, that could be prosecuted as material support in the form of speech. And I apologize if I've said this quite a bit, and so I apologize for arguments that I've made many, many times in the past and in my book. In any event, material support in the form of speech is only part of it. In the prosecution of the 5 Palestinian Americans known as the Holy Land 5 prosecution, these were individuals who were charged with providing material support, conspiring to provide material support to the Hamas movement, a banned FTO in this country, as I know you all understand. The government at first, when it prosecuted these individuals, argued that they had been running the largest Muslim charity in the United States, right? And the government conceded that what they were doing was providing unquestioned charitable activity. But the government initially said that was a money is fungible type situation, that the money for charity was freeing up money for violence. At the time the case came to trial and then retrial, the government changed its tune. It said, actually, the groups to which the Holy Land Foundation was sending money were so-called zakat committees. Zakat being one of the 5 pillars of Islam, the obligation to give charity on a yearly basis for religious Muslims. There were zakat committees that were associated in the popular mind in the Palestinian areas with the Hamas movement, and thereby gave it legitimacy. So not money is fungible, material support as legitimacy, which to this day stupefies me. The evidence that was allowed by the courts to convict the individuals came in the form of anonymous Israeli security agents who were allowed to testify as expert witness. And what that means is they were allowed to give their opinion on the evidence. A regular or lay witness is not allowed to give their opinion on the evidence. These individuals were, and their identity was shielded from the defendants, who were perceived to be such a dangerous risk to their safety that they couldn't even learn their real identity. There's a lot more to be said about this case, but we don't have the time today. Needless to say, these individuals who the government admitted were providing actual legitimate charity were convicted, and in the case and given sentences in the range from, I think it was 15 years to 65 years in the case of Ghassan al-Ashi and Shukri Abu Bakr, who remain imprisoned to this day, serving these absurdly long sentences for peaceful, charitable activities. Compare that with the individuals who were sentenced in the Proud Boys leaders and Oath Keepers leaders who were sentenced in the wake of the January 6th, in the wake of the January 6th riot, having been convicted of engaging in seditious conspiracy against the United States, to at the maximum sentence of 22 years. So 22 years for seditious conspiracy in a violent riot at the United States Capitol versus 65 years for charitable activity. Now, because terrorism is rooted so deeply in the official American structure, there's no room to argue in US courts that Palestinians have any rights to resist. When I was working on the Al-Arian prosecution, I tried to argue that the government not be allowed to assert that attacking soldiers in occupied territory could be classified and charged as murder. The court disagreed. It said unless these were lawful combatants, they operated under a clear, unless they were lawful combatants, which means 1, they operated under a clear command structure, 2, they wore insignia, 3, they carried arms openly, and 4, operated according to the rules of war. They could not claim to target anyone lawfully, and what they did was murder. Now, to be fair to the court, that is an accurate statement of the laws of war regarding people asserting that they are lawful combatants. What it means for Palestinians is they're stuck in a kind of resistance trap. Any violence against Israelis is terrorism, no matter the identity of the target, military or civilian. Now, my attempts to argue that what you could deem anti-colonial violence against soldiers on occupied territory as allowed under the 1977 first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention in court was met with a curt reply by the judge that the United States and the government, by the way, the United States never accepted or adopted the provisions of that first additional protocol. Full stop. Again, that's a true statement. In international law, which is largely how nations interact with each other and behave, powerful actors or powerful countries can decide how to act and basically dare other nations or non-state groups like the Palestinians or the UN to hold them accountable. That's the reason why that Israel, for example, could declare the Gaza Strip as a so-called enemy entity in 2007, which allowed for the imposition of a blockade and to use force as it deemed necessary to strike at that enemy entity, but allowed also Israel to completely reject any argument that the enemy entity was authorized to shoot back in any way, shape, or form, defense or otherwise. This mirrors a lot of American official thinking because, like Israel, the US considers targets and threats in very broad terms. So it allows for an assessment of danger even in an inchoate state, such as allowing attacks on targets that are likely to be a threat at some point in the future. That's the American military's view of international humanitarian law. Who makes a determination about what the threat is or where it is, etc.? That's entirely in the eye of the American or Israeli or British or Russian, etc. beholder. Because of this distorted structure in international law, which only allows a limited place for a non-nation state like the Palestinians, looking at things like the number of people killed doesn't infect the argument for these powerful nations. Remember from the 2003 invasion of Iraq, American General Tommy Franks, when he was asked about how many Iraqis were killed, he said, "We don't do body counts." Okay. And that position certainly helps officialdom, okay, distract from what we were seeing in Palestine, and not just from one perspective. Now, as many of you also know, just because the United States completely rejects Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation by force, it doesn't mean it allows peaceful resistance either. And many people have been making these remarks in the last 10 days and before, of course. So I don't claim to be offering anything radical or new. But remember, 35 states have outlawed in whole or in part the peaceful practice of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the right to boycott, still protected to this day by a 1982 Supreme Court decision, as well as crackdowns on campus activism. Now, the issue here is states and university administrators are assessing non-criminal penalties for this type of activism. How do you answer that or respond to that? Well, what we see is civil society in the United States is making a strong attempt to resist these types of restrictions, insisting on the rights to protected speech and expressive conduct, and working together in networks to try to stop repression. Now, when I was growing up and learning from my father, he had allies, but he was operating, I don't want to say entirely or largely alone, but it certainly felt like that to him. Now we have organizations like Palestine Legal, the Center for Constitutional Rights, in the university context, Students for Justice in Palestine, which, while they are vilified, they work together to show that individuals who adopt pro-Palestinian views, who advocate, who advocate for these goals, are not alone, and that allows for stronger resistance. More groups have caught up. We've also seen the landscape shift, where we now have as a main ally in these movements the Jewish Voice for Peace. The changed landscape, even from when I, for example, went to work, or when I tried to get a job as a law professor in 2006, and I'm not claiming great victimhood here, so please don't misunderstand me, but I was subject to an attack by an outside group called Stand With Us, and I felt alone, and there wasn't much that I felt could be done, right? Whereas I think nowadays we've seen that when people get attacked for their advocacy and their principled positions, there's a network there, which is a great, I think, accomplishment, despite, as we see, the constant official repression, criticism, backlash. Now, coming back to the state of affairs that we find ourselves in, what allows for this state of affairs? What allows for this construct of the Palestinian as terrorist and the idea of constantly being a threat? Let's leave the law a second to discuss dehumanization. This is one of the first things that grabbed my attention in my father's writings, was the use of language. Okay, and he pointed these things out, and this was something even a 13 or 14-year-old like myself could figure out. Okay, in much of his writing from the early mid-1980s, he noted things like, for example, then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin gave a speech in the Knesset where he referred to Palestinians. He called them terrorists, but the implication was clear. He referred to them as two-legged beasts. We were reminded of this language when Israeli Defense Minister Gallant recently referred to his enemy, the Palestinians, as human animals. Netanyahu himself used the phrase wild animals and barbarians. And sadly, this is nothing new. I myself recall the former chief Sephardic rabbi of the state of Israel, Wadie Yosef, referring to Palestinians in 2000, that was in the peace process era. He referred to them as snakes, or us as snakes. In 2014, the former Israeli Minister of the Interior, at the time she wasn't the Israeli Minister of the Interior, but she became that, Ayelet Shaked, called the Palestinians, no surprises for guessing, snakes whose homes needed to be eliminated. Okay? Palestinians and Arabs in general are savage, not civilized like Israelis. That's what we're constantly being told. And by the way, as I'm sure you've now experienced, it's not just Israelis who do this. Let's consider, and I hate we have to do this, but the recent Thomas Friedman column in the New York Times from a few days ago, where he cited former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's remark about how Israel is like a villa in the jungle, okay? In that it's civilized, but it's not unwilling to use the local unsavory methods of these savage Arabs to defend itself, okay? The language of the mainstream press is that Palestinians are savages. And what do? What do we do? Slaughter, massacre, butcher. Israelis never do that, apparently, okay? Remember the mechanized army that can rain death down on its victims in hundreds, if not thousands? They don't slaughter, okay? They don't butcher. When you're dealing with unnamed and unrecognized people with no backstory who are killed in what are called retaliatory strikes, which is what Palestinians say or Palestinians claim, there's less sympathy there. Now, I don't want to overstate it, and I know we have a lot of emotions in this time, but I do think it's not undeserved, maybe, or inapt to note that this is the type of language that's a precursor to genocide, judging from past cases. Now, I'm not an expert in that area of the law, but I have read several studies and read in that area, including on the most deadly genocide of modern times, that of Rwanda in 1994. And some of you might remember that the language of dehumanization was prominent. There was a radio station called Radio Television Libre des Mille Collines, excuse my horrible French pronunciation, or RTLM, which constantly referred to the Tutsi population of Rwanda as cockroaches, all prior to the genocidal campaigns. Now, again, maybe I exaggerate, but I remember, and this was something I remember my father pointed out multiple times in his writings. I remember the statement of former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Raphael Eitan, who was also the chief of staff of the Israeli military in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon, killing 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. And the time when and he oversaw the military at the time of the bone-chilling massacres at Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, where up to 3,000 Palestinians were killed in September 1982. In 1983, after the invasion of Lebanon, Eitan made the following remark. He said, "After we are finished settling the land," meaning the occupied territories, the territories occupied in 1967, he said, quote, "all the Arabs will be able to do is scuttle around like drugged cockroaches in a bottle." Now, lest it be unclear that what is allowed the Israelis is not allowed the Palestinians, especially in light of the fact that there are some 199 Israeli hostages in Gaza, remember that the Israeli Supreme Court in 1997 approved the use of holding prisoners without charge or any due process as so-called bargaining chips. And that was in the context of negotiating over prisoner exchanges during the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. That was in a case involving 2 Lebanese men who were held as bargaining chips, okay, authorized by the Israeli Supreme Court. In 2019, that authorization for holding individuals as bargaining chips was extended from the living to the dead, as the Israeli Supreme Court allowed the retention of corpses of those Palestinians killed by the Israeli military to be used as, you guessed it, bargaining chips in negotiations over a prisoner exchange. All while we consider all this, okay, we consider all this in a particular context where the Israelis enjoy nonstop credibility, okay, nonstop credibility. This is despite the fact that you may remember, just using one example, one of the current Israeli military spokespeople in the last round of fighting in May 2021, issued a statement that Israel had begun a ground invasion when it hadn't, with the goal of drawing Hamas fighters out so they could be hit. And he admitted that he made it up for a military advantage. The world press, even the Western press, was upset, but that doesn't mean that that individual isn't still being given credibility to speak and to speak on behalf of the Israeli military, and the Western press acts as if his words are true. This is, of course, a personal issue for me because my wife's first cousin was Shireen Abu Akleh. And you might remember in her case, and Shireen, by the way, was also the maid of honor at our wedding. So we had Edward Said and Shireen Abu Akleh at the same wedding. You might remember that first Shireen was killed in the crossfire. First she may have been killed by Palestinian gunmen. Then she was killed in the crossfire where there were active Palestinian militants. Then she may have been killed by Israeli troops, but in any event, it was an accident. Okay. This is the force that we're up against that enjoys this credibility. Okay. By the way, just as a kind of an aside here, I want to note, has it been pointed out when we consider what's going on in Gaza that the Israelis have a military censor? That is to say that stories can be censored before they get out. Okay. Before that, there was a Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which has now been disbanded. But the point was to explain, the Israeli term is hasbara, the Israeli position. Some would call that propaganda. This is all important because it's never questioned what, at least it hasn't been, what it is the Israelis are claiming. The most recent one is the idea that Palestinians and Hamas are engaging in rapes of their captives. Now, again, I'm no expert truly in this area, but I do know that if there are deficiencies or things to be criticized in Palestinian society, they generally get made. I'm thinking about, for example, numerous reports about honor killings in Palestinian society. I don't remember arguments about Palestine having a horrible rape culture, but the presumption is here that Palestinians, of course, are going to rape their Israeli captives. Again, I question where that comes from. And this is important because we're dealing with a context where, as we've seen now in this country, these unquestioned attitudes are leading to dangerous results. Okay. We saw that there was a boy who actually shares my name, Wadie E, who was killed by his landlord, stabbed because of his landlord being so filled with hatred towards the Palestinians, based on all that he'd been seeing. We've seen that there was in Denver, a Palestinian family has been harassed based on all this coverage, which, by the way, conflates with the phenomenon of Islamophobia in this country. There's a report that's about to be released or soon to be released by the Center for Security, Race and Rights at Rutgers University, which basically documents how Islamophobia has allowed for the proliferation of anti-Palestinian activity in this country and how the two work in tandem. We see that when the FBI director, Christopher Wray, gave a briefing on domestic security in the United States, he was concerned that Hamas would be active, or lone wolves on behalf of Hamas would be active, assuming without offering us reasons why or how this would happen, not considering the other side of it, that Arabs and Palestinians would be attacked. Of course, he changed his tune in light of the killing of the young 6-year-old Wadie El-Fayoum in Illinois, but still, the initial impulse was telling, I think. Now, I think I've talked a lot, and I apologize if I've gone on too long, but I have one more thing to note here. Today's news about the bombing by Israeli forces of Al Ahli Baptist Hospital and the killing of hundreds of Palestinians brings to mind my experience in 1996 when I was actually living in Palestine at the time, and the Israeli government under then Prime Minister Shimon Peres decided to attack Lebanon. The more cynical observation was he did it to try to win the election that year, which he ended up losing anyway, based on the fact that there was a series of Palestinian attacks on Israeli buses, suicide bombings on Israeli buses that he felt he had to respond to. So he decided to attack Lebanon. And the result of that was, at least if I can paint the picture very briefly here, every day, this is of course before the proliferation of satellite television and digital communication, social media, etc. So every night in the evening, on Israeli television, you could watch the military spokespeople kind of do a presentation. We have terrorist target X here, so we hit it. We have terrorist target Y there, we hit it. And here's a video of us hitting it. And then on April 18th, the Israelis hit a UN compound in a school in Qana in Lebanon, killed 106 people. Okay. And then all the discussions about the precision weapons and how accurate they were went out the window. It was a mistake. We were firing at Hezbollah fighters who were hiding in the school. This idea of the hiding, using human shields, that trope was deployed. Okay. Eventually, the United Nations investigated the Israeli attack on Qana, and it was a Dutch general by the name of Franklin von Kappen who issued a report. He concluded in response to the idea that this was a mistake. He said, while the possibility cannot be ruled out completely, it is unlikely that the shelling of the United Nations compound was the result of gross technical and/or procedural errors. He didn't want to say it was intentional, but that's in UN language, that's saying something. Finally, at the end of his 1998 film, In Search of Palestine, you see my father confronting Israeli soldiers who are guarding a bulldozer that was destroying the dwellings of the Jahalin Bedouin near Jerusalem to make way for the expansion of the settlement of Ma'ali Adumim. My father, dressed to the nines, goes up to one of the soldiers and says, I know you're a decent. You can stop this. Why don't you stop this? The soldier shrugged his shoulders. Here's hoping that scene will not continue to replay itself, and that at some point along the way we can see a better future, even at this dark time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wadie, for this informative and thoughtful talk. I invite now my dear friend Darrell Lee, who teaches anthropology and law at the University of Chicago. Professor Lee will share some reflections and questions, and then for our audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask Professor Saeed, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A feature, the box at the bottom of the screen, and I will make sure to convey your questions to Professor Saeed. Professor Darrell, the floor is yours.
Can you all hear me okay?
We can barely hear you.
Is that better?
Slightly.
I apologize. I'm having some technical issues, and I also apologize for this camera angle being so strange. In fact, I think I'll just turn my camera off so it's not distracting. So if you can't hear me, just let me know. Well, yeah, thank you for these reflections. And I have so many thoughts and so many feelings. And I came into this with such a heavy heart, sort of reeling from the murder of the boy, this weekend. First, I just want to thank you for recapping so powerfully a very simple truth, but one that I think has drifted away from people's attention in recent years, which is that the foundations of so-called terrorism law in this country, in the United States, are absolutely built on a foundation of hostility to Palestinian liberation. The war on terror is often thought of in terms of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim animus, and of course that's true at many levels, but I think folks sometimes don't appreciate how much specifically Palestine was at the heart of all of these major initiatives in terrorism law before 9/11. The first time terrorism, the word even appears in the federal law, was actually in 1969 in the Foreign Assistance Act, and it was directly in relation to Palestinian refugees. The first time terrorism was introduced into immigration law as a basis for exclusion was also done in specific connection to officers of the PLO. So if you were an officer of the PLO, you were automatically considered to be engaged in terrorist activity under immigration law. The first and only time Congress declared anyone to be a terrorist organization was the PLO in 1987. And then the history with that you mentioned of all of these terrorism lists, they do, as you said, they originate from the Oslo period. The executive order that you mentioned was, I think, in many ways, an attempt by President Clinton to boost the lagging electoral fortunes of Yitzhak Rabin. And the first time Al-Qaeda was actually added to a U.S. terrorism list was actually this one. They were basically put into the list that was made for Oslo because that was the actual, that was the mechanism that they had that existed at the time. So thank you for powerfully sort of recapping all of that. Stepping back, I also wanted to thank you for sharing these stories, and especially the story of your trip to Gaza. I never heard that story before, but it really reminded me of so many things about your father's legacy, but especially his urgency. I didn't know he had this thing about never being late for meetings. I mean, it checks out in so many ways, but the urgency of his voice and of his effort and of his thought is something that I think remains so powerfully inspiring as an example for everyone today. So I guess one question I had, I mean, I'll ask the obvious question, right? The question that I've heard so many people ask in the past 10 days. In the first day of these recent events, I posted a photograph on social media of the famous photograph of Edward Said throwing a stone at the border with Lebanon. And there was an interesting debate that emerged. And I noticed a lot of people sort of saying, well, Edward Said would have thought this, and Edward Said would have said that about, violence and resistance and all of these categories. So I think I can put that question to you. What would he have to say about the moment that we're in, taking into account all of the changes of the past few decades, changes that in many ways were made possible by his interventions, changes like the shifts in discourse that we've seen, and how I think the incremental progress on discourse around Palestine in this country is really at a moment of being tested right now. We're going to go back to square one, or will this withstand kind of assault? So that's the first question. But the second question actually is not what would Edward Said say, but what does Wadie E say? You are a scholar and you are a practitioner, and you have dwelled on all of these issues, for such a long time, in all the ways that you outlined in your remarks. So I really want to hear, your stance on, what is it that people need to know? I don't mean, Thomas Friedman's readers. I mean, people in this room, right? People who are committed right? But are maybe experiencing uncertainty or confusion about how to make sense of the recent events. I really would appreciate your sort of guidance and clarity on thinking through some of these issues. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be in conversation with both of you.
Thank you, Daryl. That's very thoughtful of you to offer those reflections. You know, I thought of that the issue specifically with respect to immigration law. You know, it's I don't know how many. This again, I'm pretty sure about this. There's an element of speculation here, but for example, when Mahmoud Abbas comes to the United States, I'm pretty sure he needs a waiver as a member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He needs a waiver to get a visa to come here. He doesn't just get in because, you know, they invite him. Because he's a member of the PLO, he's considered de facto an inadmissible terrorist. And he needs a special waiver from the Secretary of State to get in. So that's something to think about when we consider, among all the various other weaknesses of the Palestinian Authority and its, you know, term-ended president from however many, you know, a decade, 14 years ago, or whatever it is, who still claims to be the president. He still needs a waiver to get here, and he is considered a terrorist in the view of American immigration law. So I really appreciate that point and some of the other points. You know, I've been thinking about the issue of, you know, obviously I'm no soothsayer, and I can't tell you what my dad would have thought, but I think the issue of violence, political violence by the Palestinians was something that he really tried to grapple with and struggle with. And he wanted to create a kind of a moral position that put him above or above reproach in this area. So, you know, you see, and people have pointed it out. I think Peter Baynard had a piece where he pointed out all the times that my father, or one of the times that my father, you know, condemned attacks by Palestinians on Israeli civilians, etc. And so I think that, you know, to the extent that we're speculating, I think that he would probably have, you know, I don't think he would deviate 100% from that, okay, while also recognizing that the Israeli military response is savage enough to warrant some sort of response, some sort of resistance, for sure. And I bring up those points not because I really have the way forward. I mean, I'm sort of stuck, and you know, because I think you see what we see. One of the limits maybe of my position is I don't really have it in me to understand how to kind of go forward. What I have it in me is a kind of what I used to be as a public defender, kind of hold the line at its very, you know, to kind of break it down to its very essence, to say that there is an unfair situation. Let's at least identify it and address it to see what is proper going forward. Okay. You know, because arguments about anti-colonial violence and is this a colonial situation and getting bogged down in the use of language, you know, that I talked about a little in the talk, I think that becomes very, very, very difficult and problematic. And we have to deal with things like the law, international law, domestic law, you know, about targeting civilians, right? And that is a bigger, deeper conversation than I'm capable of at this time, when you see things like we've seen today with hospitals being bombed and the Israelis trotting out the usual, oh, it was the Islamic Jihad that did this, you know, where they misfired a weapon. The number of times Palestinians have successfully or unsuccessfully misfired and killed hundreds is too numerous to count if you believe the Israelis, right? They seem to have more success killing their own people, you know, than doing anything else, if we believe some of these accounts. So I look at that with a great deal of skepticism, and you know, and I think that's part of what's kind of the construct that we're grappling with. And I would say, as a last kind of point, my father, I think towards his last years, really wanted to have some sort of make some real effort at a kind of a way forward, right? At pointing the way forward with his discussion of the one-state solution, which he didn't invent, of course, right? And he didn't come up with it, but it was a way he was able to discuss a future and give people hope, and try to give people hope and try to articulate a vision, which unfortunately might feel as far away as ever. But I think he would struggle with some of these issues, but ultimately come back to the Palestinians and their humanity and their deserving of rights like any other people.
So, Jihad, with your permission, or should we move to the Q&A?
I'm happy to read the questions because some members of the audience can't fully hear you, Daryl. So thank you so much for sharing this reflection and these important questions. So I'll start with a question from Ismail Bazian. And he asks about your opinion, Professor Saeed, on the two-state solution, if it's still applicable, as he remembers that the late Edward Said had a different opinion on the matter. I'm not sure how we would approach this question on a night like this, but I think it might be useful to perhaps reflect on how Edward Said talked about the process that was put in motion starting the mid-90s with the Oslo Accords, that many described as the path forward, right? And you talked a little bit about other paths that others wanted to pursue. But the peace process, like everything else, was violently imposed on Palestinians. So, and I think there's like a personal aspect to this question. I think the past few days, many could say it was like the past few days have been an I told you so kind of moment for many. And I think it's important to hear your thoughts on this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jihad. I think my father, one of the things that his opposition to the Oslo process was not kind of a snap decision. It was something that had been building, especially in the way, and I'm sure many of you follow his work, knew this about his deep frustration. I think there was a moment of real hope that there was an actual attempt by Palestinians to compromise and offer a way forward in the November 1988 Algiers meeting of the Palestine National Council and the Declaration of Independence of the State of Palestine and the acceptance of two states, which in retrospect can certainly be criticized as a strategic point. But that was where when that started to break down, particularly Yasser Arafat's position on the occupation of Kuwait by the Iraqis, really disillusioned him. And then how the Gulf War itself actually played out in a very violent and kind of what he felt was a very unnecessary manner, I think. And then we had the Madrid peace process, which was really just kind of the Israelis kind of going through the motions. And then it led to this so-called breakthrough at Oslo, which was behind everyone's back in a kind of a super slapdash manner. I think really deeply offended him, because you had a people who, during the Intifada, the first Intifada, had been making a real, had been saying, okay, the world wants us to resist nonviolently, so they did that. And what did they get out of it but these kind of great power games? And what's very interesting is, my father, talked a lot about how what was being offered then is what's being offered now, which was some kind of autonomy, right? I mean, 1967, after the Israelis occupy the West Bank and Gaza Strip, what's the first plan that gets articulated? It was called the Alon Plan by the, then Israeli Foreign Minister Yigal Alon, who, basically says what you can have is autonomy. We're going to take part of the West Bank. You can kind of have autonomy in this other part that's going to be part of Jordan. And Gaza was kind of to be maybe depopulated, people sent to Egypt. Okay. But that's always been the refrain. In 1988, when my father and Brahim Abu-Lughod, his great friend, met Secretary of State George Shultz, Americans, to talk about, as a kind of, because the U.S. government wouldn't talk with the PLO, as Daryl was saying, the PLO is a terrorist organization, but they would talk to American Palestinians who had ties with the national movement. They were both my father and Ibrahim were members of the PNC. They met with Schultz, who basically said, yeah, don't. First of all, they both said George Shultz didn't really want to talk about Palestine. He wanted to talk about how they all went to Princeton in some form or another. He wasn't that comfortable talking about Palestine, but he said what you can have is autonomy. And we're seeing now that as the Israeli government openly says there's no more Palestinian state to be discussed, what you can have is, paraphrasing the words of the Saudi crown prince, a better life, right? That's not statehood. That's not national. Those aren't national rights. This is just a kind of the rehashing of the autonomy point over and over again. So I think he was deeply offended by that. I think he was deeply offended by the fact that the Palestinians offered so much in Oslo. If you read the exchange of letters, the PLO agrees to, recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and to renounce violence and all this stuff. And the Israeli, letter in exchange was very short. It basically just said that the state of Israel agrees to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization as its, as the representative of the Palestinian people. That was it. So the concept, things like legitimacy and things like national rights and statehood were being kind of given away at a very, very, very low price. And he was, I think, very upset about that this people who had struggled for so much deserved better, his people.
Thank you so much for this beautiful answer, Dr. Saeed. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. There are actually two questions that they deal with the law, they deal with Palestinian activism and the legal challenges that face Palestinians, whether here or in Palestine. And I think these questions are going to be pressing in the weeks, months, perhaps years to come in light of the events that are unfolding. One question is about explaining how the anti-PDS laws have been able to get passed in so many states and how they managed to remain. Are they not a gross violation of the First Amendment? So this is a question about here, and I know this probably requires a lecture on its own. So perhaps guiding us into how we can navigate this question and perhaps, especially in light of the chilling effects of the anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And then there is another question, which I think relates to the situation on the ground, that deals with, people perhaps take for granted the issue of international law and that it should be respected and applied. But why is there complete disregard to international law when it comes to Israel? So these are, I think, two questions that I hope we can touch on, and then maybe these are all conversations that we can continue in a future occasion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. With respect to the BDS points, and I'm sure Daryl also can speak to this as well, but with respect to the BDS laws, we need to remember that first of all, the activism on this, as we've seen, pro-Israeli groups are very, I think, very effective in how they lobby, whether it's Congress or state legislatures, for laws that they feel serve their interests. I mean, I think that's clear. We don't have a kind of countervailing, series of Arab or Palestinian, kind of legislative lobby groups that can mount the kind of pressure and get these issues considered by legislatures in the same way. It's always been the case in this country. So that there's that dynamic. As far as this is something that's coming to the fore. There is I think it's a 1982 Supreme Court case on the right to boycott called the NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, which involved the NAACP boycotting a hardware store in, I think it was in Mississippi, and the hardware store then sued the NAACP, and it became a big to-do because the hardware store didn't hire and didn't have anybody black working there. So I'm sorry, I should be more up on these cases, given up on the facts, given that I am aware of this issue acutely. But in any event, the Supreme Court ruled that the right to boycott is protected by the First Amendment. And what we've seen is there was a case in the Eighth Circuit, which is the federal circuit, basically comprising states from the middle of the country, Arkansas, Nebraska, I can name them all here, but I think the point is that in that area of the country, a law from the BDS ban in Arkansas, the anti-BDS law in Arkansas, survived and was upheld as constitutional by the Eighth Circuit. And basically, the argument is kind of one that would make your make non-lawyers and even lawyers' stomachs turn a little bit in terms of, how conduct, which can be regulated, right, differs from speech. So the state basically saying you have to sign a pledge that you won't boycott Israel to work with the state is governing the conduct of the state and who it wants to deal with, which is not the same as protected speech, which is a very, very, very narrow technicality on which to turn, which I think we all recognize it as a kind of an attack on people's freedom of speech and freedom of expression type rights, freedom of association. But it's been very narrowly construed by a very, very conservative court in one part of the country. In other parts of the country, these laws have been struck down, but that's the first of the federal circuits, the courts of appeals, to rule on it. So we'll have to keep watching that one. But I'm not entirely hopeful. I'm a little bit more pessimistic, I guess, than I used to be. And Daryl makes a good point here about how the laws have also been changed to be more kind of symbolic, which has, I think, been a positive development of the backlash, because it's such a, the United States, the kind of hallmark freedom is that freedom of speech, freedom of expression, et cetera, that's encapsulated by the First Amendment. So I think there's also some countervailing trends there that maybe give cause for optimism. As far as international law is concerned, I tried to touch on the fact that it's very, it's very disappointing. It's very disappointing to kind of consider what international law has to say. It's not there to offer Palestinians a way forward as a nation and to offer national rights. But I think what we've seen is, lawyers in good conscience have tried to make use of international law to make the argument in favor of Palestinian rights. I think one of the recent efforts to kind of insist that the International Criminal Court have a look at Israeli activities, Israeli actions, Israeli crimes against Palestinians, whether in the kind of the larger context of attacks on journalists, settlements, the killing of Shireen, etc. I think is a way of what lawyers would call, kind of making a record, basically putting it, making the effort and saying that we were here, we tried to do this, even if it doesn't go their way, as we see in the International Criminal Court context. The prosecutors, in the case of the previous prosecutor, she slow-walked the investigation. She objected to it and tried to get it stopped multiple times until she was ordered by the investigating judges to go forward. And even though she was trying her best to get rid of it, the Trump administration sanctioned her. And then her term ended, and we now have a new prosecutor who seems completely uninterested, if not hostile, to the idea of the investigation of Israeli criminal violations of Palestinian rights going forward. So, international law, I think, is useful in terms of making arguments, but expecting it to effect change is maybe asking much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think with this, it's time to conclude this event. And I'm really grateful for you, Professor Saeed, for joining us today, and for Professor Darrell Lee, and for everyone. I'm sure people have been sleep deprived, glued to their TVs and mobile phones, following the events in Palestine, in Gaza. And before I conclude this event, I would like to highlight that the Jerusalem Fund has launched an emergency appeal to raise funds that will go to support UNRWA's relief efforts in Gaza. I put the link in the chat, so if you would like to donate, please go ahead. We'd really appreciate supporting our work. Professor Saeed, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was, for me personally, a conversation that took me a little bit away from the TV. I'm still in touch with my family in Gaza, but it's always important to connect with this kind of analysis and reflection and understanding, especially in moments like this, and to foresee the challenges to come. And a lot of members of our communities are concerned, and I think we're lucky that we have people like you and people like Professor Lee, who are equipped with the knowledge and the understanding and the analysis to help us navigate these complex questions that will face our communities here, and also reflect on the challenges that face our people back home in Palestine. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and thank you all for attending. The recording will be available, and we will share it with you once we edit it. And please stay tuned to updates about our programs and events. And There might be some changes in the days and weeks to come, depending on the situation on the ground, but we will keep you informed. Professor Said, thank you so much. Professor Lee, thank you so much. And thank you all for being with us tonight.